Hello, I'm Cass. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to be bringing you my top 5 favorite books of 2023. I have read so many books this year, and I've also read so many good books this year, and I'm just so excited to be able to share with you my finalized top 5 list for the year. Now, this is my 3rd year doing this, and it has been the most difficult year thus far with narrowing down this list, I will say. I read Brandon Sanderson for the first time this year. Honestly, his books could have just swept the top spot of my favorite books. So I had a lot of trouble narrowing down and knocking Brando Sando's books off of my list to try to make a more diversified list with my different readings. With my top 5, I feel like there's no really particular order, but I will be starting with my top book of the year, but then spots 2 through 5 are very up in the air in terms of favorites. And like I just said, we are going to start with my top favorite book, which is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is Brandon Sanderson's second secret novel project. He released 4 novels throughout the entirety of 2023 that, he just had extra time to spare to write 4 extra novels during 2020. And so he decided to bless us with the books this year. I really picked up Tress on a whim, not having any expectations. I actually read this on my phone. I had some Kindle credits, so I ended up purchasing this book. I read most of it when I was getting actually new tattoos, so there's a fun fact for you. But let's talk about the book. Tress follows our main character, Tress. Wouldn't you know it? The story starts with her on this cozy little island. She's collecting little cups. She has a cute little crush on this dude named Charlie, and things are going well. She has a very peaceful, quaint life. She's pretty content other than the unrequited love situation. However, one day the Duke decides that Charlie needs to go and be married. So he is sent off on a ship. About a year passes and Tress is really sad because she, misses her little crush. She misses Charlie. Then news comes back that Charlie has been captured by a sorceress, and Tress is not having that. She decides that she needs to go and rescue Charlie. However, in doing so, she has to cross the Spore Sea, which is the main aspect of this book that made it so interesting. There are multiple different seas, and they're called Spore Seas because when the spores are active, it's insta-death. If you get touched by a spore, you're gone. And that's why people aren't really allowed to leave the island that Tress lives on because it's so dangerous to traverse through the Spore Seas. But Tress makes her way onto a ship, and we get to see her earn her place on this ship. There's a talking rat named Huck. Love him. And there's so many twists and turns, and the character development for Tress is so beautiful. She is such a strong character, and yet she doesn't begin that way. She truly grows into and becomes herself throughout the course of the adventure, and I'm a sucker for a book that takes place on a boat. And that is the majority of this book. It takes place on a ship. I love getting to meet different crews, and they're always so interesting. There was this overlooming threat of mutiny as well, because why not sprinkle a little mutiny on top of everything else that goes on in this book? It is just such a delight, and I truly love Brandon Sanderson's writing so much, and that is why Tress ended up taking the top spot for this year. Absolutely obsessed. I cannot wait to reread this and annotate it. Something else that is also quite fun about this book is the chapter headers. There's leaves, you see, but as the story progresses, look at that. And for the parts, there's these beautiful leafy illustrations, and it was really fun. I did read it on my phone like I had mentioned, so I didn't get to experience them as prominently as in a book. I definitely want to someday reread this in the future because, like I said, I'm obsessed, and I'm so happy that this took our top spot. Alright, I feel like I blathered enough about that, so we're starting off strong with the video. Starting off with my favorite, and then like I said, spots 2 through 5, they're kind of a toss-up. I enjoyed all of these for different reasons and read them all at very different times and moods. Some of these are just really good, really beautiful storytellings, and then some of them are just cute little Renaissance romances by Jen DeLuca. This is Well Matched, which is the 3rd book in the Renaissance romance series. If you have seen some of my vlogs, you know that I read this entire series twice within 4 months of each other. Literally obsessed. I adore the Renaissance Festival, and you give me a cute romance that takes place at one, Thank you. A lot of this book, though, ironically, doesn't take place at the Renaissance Festival. We get to follow two characters, April and Mitch. April has been living in Willow Creek for the past 12 years, and in Willow Creek there's like the big Renaissance Festival, but she's just not very involved. She's very cynical, very closed off, very private. She was involved in a car accident a few years prior to this book starting, and she just doesn't like the small town, busybody, gossipy vibes that she perceives Willow Creek to have. She thinks that people being concerned for her is people wanting to know like what's going on with her life. But then we have Mitch, who is super involved in the town. He coaches at the school, he's super involved in the Renaissance Festival, and he's very outgoing, very boisterous, very flirty. And getting to see the two characters bounce off each other in that way was so fun. I never thought I would enjoy a book where they're primarily renovating a house, but something about renovating, like forced proximity, it was doing something to me, honestly. I think each character brought out a different side and they just balanced each other very, very well. I love how we slowly got to see April come out of her shell and we slowly got to see a different side of Mitch as well. And I know this is not for everyone. It is still a cheesy, cute little romance that's a little cliche. However, I absolutely adore this series, and books 3 and 4 in this series were definitely my top favorite. I liked Well Traveled and Well Matched a little bit more than I liked Well Met and Well Played. You know I had to put this in my top 5 because obviously I read it twice, and every time I finish reading it, I want to pick it up again. And then anytime I read a romance that disappoints me and isn't quite to my expectations, I want to reread this as well, just so I can get like a good dose of romance that I really enjoy. I will be picking this up again next year for sure. You can't stop me from rereading this. It's so cute and so wholesome. Next on my list is yet another Brandon Sanderson book. Like I said, I read Brando Sando for the first time this year, so I got to experience what is Brando Sando, and it was such a delight. But that is The Final Empire, which is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. I binged this trilogy so hard, let me tell you. I'm obsessed. I loved the cast of characters we got to follow in this book, and the magic system. The magic system. I am constantly in awe of how creative Brandon Sanderson can be with creating these magic systems. But let's talk about the plot. So in our world, the land is ruled by the Lord Ruler, who is a little bit of a tyrant, and the plot of the book is to overthrow this bitch because he's not good for the people. He is not good for the people. So we get to follow Kelsier and Vin and their misfit bundle of bandits. We'll go with that. We are following Kelsier as he kind of builds this group of rebels, and they all have different abilities because of the magic system, which I'm going to try to explain in the most simple way possible. So it's called Elemency, and there's 10 different metals, 4 of which are mental metals. For example, one of the metals is zinc, and you can use that to enhance people's emotions. So not necessarily control them, but make them stronger. So if someone's like kind of mad, you can make them like really pissed off. To do so, you have to like ingest a vial of zinc. And then we have 4 physical metals. So we have, let's say, iron and steel. One is to push metal away and one is to pull metal towards you. And each metal user has like a different name. For example, there's like a coin shot. Most of the characters in this book are called mistings, which means that they can only control one metal. They can only use one metal. And then anyone that can use all of the metals is called Mistborn, which is what Kelsier is. So that just really, every time I think about it, it makes me want to reread the series again. The magic system is really what got me hooked on this book. It was such an interesting concept that drew me in immediately. But then the characters, especially Kelsier and Vin, they were so well written. I always worry a little bit with fantasy writers who are men and they're a little bit older, and them writing like younger female heroines. I feel like they sometimes really fuck it up. However, Vin felt so authentic and so well executed that she is definitely one of my top favorite characters ever. Like, love her. What a queen. Her character starts out by living on the streets, and she's very for herself, right? When you're on the streets, it's all about your own survival and watching out for your back and your back only. And she was already kind of betrayed once, so she has a lot of trust issues. Therefore, when she gets brought into Kelsier's group, she has to work to overcome and learn how to work with a team. But also, then she gets more trust issues because there's so much betrayal in this book, but I honestly live for it, low-key. And as for Kelsier, it's really interesting to see his character arc and where it leads him to, because he's a very proud individual, but he has many flaws, but he is so revered, so it kind of fuels his ego because he is Mistborn, so you know, he's kind of very powerful and the one that brought this whole group together. It's a wonderful story. Love the trilogy. It wraps up so well. Things happen that are so outside the scope of what I could have imagined the series leading to, and I can't wait to eventually pick up Stormlight Archives because those also take place in the Cosmere. And Brandon Sanderson, just top favorite author. Like, if that wasn't obvious from 3 books in and 2 of them are already his. My next book is Babel or Babel by R.F. Kuang. I said back in February, the second month of the year, I was like, this is going to be my top favorite book because R.F. Kuang is my favorite author and this was absolutely stunning. Those things are all true. However, that was PBS, pre-Brandon Sanderson, okay? My entire bookish world shifted when I picked up a Brando Sando book. However, Babel was so well executed and absolutely stunning. However, this also felt like a fever dream when I read it because basically, I read this very densely packed 544-page tome basically in one sitting. Basically in one day. I waited until last minute to read it for my Patreon book club that I had back in February, and I don't recommend reading this in one sitting. I really recommend taking your time, slowly working your way through this book and absorbing every possible detail that you can because R.F. Kuang packs a punch in this book. We tackle colonialism, racism, languages, translation, and the necessity of violence, and which is obviously like part of the title. It's a really long title. It's like Babel and the necessity of violence and arcane history, but thankfully we all just call it Babel. In this book, we are following Robin Swift, whose entire family dies, and then he was brought over to London in order to study languages to eventually earn his spot into Oxford. This book has a very hard magic system, meaning that it has very set rules and it's very strict with its magic. It's not, I like to compare it to Stephanie Garber, who has just a really lax, whimsical type of open magic system, but in R.F. Kuang's Babel, it's a very hard magic system, and it's rooted in languages, translations, and it's called silverworking, and it makes the British Empire very, very lucrative and very rich. They're translating words into their purest form onto silver bars, which makes them have magic. It's a little complex to explain, believe it or not, a little more complex than my Brandon Sanderson explanation. There is a group trying to overthrow and infiltrate Babel and this whole silverworking system, and that's when the plot of the book kind of starts picking up, is when we start having correspondence with these rebel groups. We also follow 3 other characters, which is Remy, Letty, and Victoire, and all of these characters come from very different backgrounds and are very different yet somewhat united in their ways. There's a lot of betrayal that happens, there's a lot of action. I will say towards the end is when things really start picking up. This is marketed as dark academia, which it is, but in a massive chunk of this book it is very academia before it turns dark academia. Something else that was so lovely about this book is the fact that it's a standalone, and I feel like it's difficult to write a book that is so strong, it tackles so many subjects, and yet make it a standalone that wraps up so beautifully, and yet R.F. Kuang was able to do that, and I truly still envy her. She is so smart, and so much research was put into this book. I will say though, my least favorite part about this was the footnotes. I do recommend listening to the audiobook, that way you can always catch when there is an asterisk and go down to the footnotes, because in the audiobook the narrators swap when they're reading the footnotes, so it's really easy to digest that way, and the narrators are literally one of my favorite audiobooks. The narration was perfection, truly. And I wish I could have just listened to the audiobook the entire time, but like I said, I was in a mad rush to finish this book. However, even though it wasn't my #1 favorite book, like I had predicted it would be back in February, it still did make my top 5 list. The last book on my top 5 list is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. I thought my list was set. I thought I had my top 5 books, and then I picked up the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy, and V.E. Schwab got her redemption arc, because let me tell you, I read Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That was my first V.E. Schwab book, and that was my favorite book back in 2021. But then I read a couple other V.E. Schwab books, and I was not impressed, and I was about to give up on her, I'm not gonna lie. But then I decided to pick up A Darker Shade of Magic, and A Gathering of Shadows just hit the sweet spot for me. So on this book, obviously we've already kind of established the magic system, which is that there's there's 4 different Londons. We have Kel, who is an Antari, which means that he can travel between all 4 Londons, and he kind of works as a courier, as a messenger. However, in this book, we get to see some more Delilah Bard action, and Delilah Bard is my favorite character from the series, and honestly, she's pretty high up there with Vin in terms of how much I love her, and she's so good. She is an aspiring pirate slash thief slash badass and slash I love her so much. In this book, I feel like we have 2 main parts. Part 1, we are following Delilah while she's on a ship. And we already know that I'm a sucker for a book on a ship. So, you know, that kind of got me. We're introduced to more characters. We're introduced to the crew a little bit. We also get a little bit of a like political setup in part 1. But then part 2 is also a really good part because I was a little sad when Delilah got off the boat. I was like, man, put her back on the boat. However, we get a magical tournament in part 2. It's called the Element Games, and a bunch of these magicians come to compete in a tournament. And let me tell you, that was so bloody fun. And the second part of the book didn't really focus on anything too like political until near the end, which then set up for book 3. Magic tournament, boat. Put that together and you're making my top 5 list. So that wraps up my top 5 favorite books for 2023, but I do have a few honorable mentions that I want to put in here. So starting with Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, because I realized that I love this book and I couldn't put it in my top favorite books because Brandon Sanderson could not sweep this category, but here we are. Warbreaker was actually the very first Brandon Sanderson book that I picked up. Katie and I decided to pick this up back in April, I believe, for the Wyverns and Words book club, and it is a standalone in the Cosmere, meaning that you get to be introduced to a really cool magic system. It wraps up okay. There's supposed to be a sequel, however it's been like 11, 13, 15, 14, I don't know how many years, many years. However, I was quite content with it as a standalone. And this is also my recommendation. If you want to get into Brandon Sanderson, start with a standalone because then you don't really have to commit that hard. Because once you commit, you're gonna be wanting to pick up every single one of his works. We follow quite the cast of characters. We have Siri and Vienna. Siri kind of annoyed me because all I could think about is Siri from like, you know, Apple, like the robot, you know. They are 2 princesses, and one of them needs to be sent off to marry the God King, who's super evil, super bad. One of them has been trained their entire life in order to fulfill this role and make sure there's peace between these 2 kingdoms. I think it's kingdom. Honestly, I can't remember like the minor details like that. However, at the last minute, the king decides, actually, this daughter, I think she's my favorite, so I'm gonna just send off the other one to marry this evil king. And it's fine. We get to follow those 2 characters, one in which is having to deal with the God King, and the other in which is trying to rescue her sister who was wrongly sent off to do her job. We also get to follow a god named Lightsong, who's very reluctantly a god, and he's a really fun character. He brings a lot of humor into the story, and that's something that I think Brandon Sanderson really nails, at least for me, is his sense of humor is so good. It's not too over the top, but there's definitely moments that get a little chuckle out of me. And then we have Vasher, who is an assassin who wields my favorite character, Nightblood, who is a sentient sword. Something about sentient objects just really do it for me. And when they're bloodthirsty trying to kill everyone too, come on now. Like, it's so fun, and I love seeing Vasher deal with Nightblood. As for the magic system, we focus a lot on color and on breaths, which I kind of think are like souls. Essentially, you can only collect breaths one at a time. However, the more breaths that you have, almost like the higher in the hierarchy you can be. And then the magic works from like drawing colors out of things and making objects move. It's a little complex to explain, and I don't remember all of the fine details, but I do remember Vasher like drawing color out of like a curtain, and then the curtain could strangle people. So something like that. It's very unique, and I love the focus on colors. Then we have Checkin Mate by Ellie Hazelwood. This did end up making an honorable mention because this was definitely an absolute shock for me with how much I enjoyed it. It was definitely one of my top romances underneath the Well Met series, because we've already talked about that, you know, that took a top spot. However, Checkin Mate was Ellie Hazelwood's YA debut, and although it is a contemporary romance, I feel like we get to really dive in and get to know Mallory as a main character, and we also get to focus on relationships between her mother and her sisters. Her actions are also quite influenced by actions of her dad, and it's really interesting to see her character development throughout. And then, you know, we also have Nolan Sawyer, who is such a sweet little boy, and I love him so much. He is such a simp for Mallory. It was a really, really fun book, and I annotated it. It had so many funny, cute moments. It did have a few Ali Hazelwood moments, like the word banana pants was used. And I will never not preface talking about this book by saying that the word banana pants was used. That way you can adjust your expectations a little bit. But in terms of YA, I think Ali Hazelwood really nailed it. Also, the supporting characters in this book were so solid and memorable, and I love when the cast of characters feels very authentic and they're all very unique in their own individual ways. And I love how their environment and their backstories can influence all of their current actions, which then in turn affects the plot. It was so fun. The plot was plotting so good, and then when the romance started happening, it made it even better. Ali Hazelwood nailed this YA debut in my opinion, and I am an Ali Hazelwood girly, what can I say? Next we have a book that I really picked up on a whim. I literally went to the bookstore, saw it, bought it, and then picked it up that very same day when I got home, which never happens. And that is Ender's Shadow by Orson Scott Card. I'm not big into picking up sci-fi, even though I love sci-fi. That's a thing that I'm fixing in 2024. Okay, we're working on it. Initially, I thought this book was just Ender's Game, but from Bean's point of view, which is a supporting character in Ender's Game. However, it was so much deeper than that, and I was blown out of the water, truly. The first part of the book, we get to follow Bean as he grows up on the street as a young, weak kid, and he ends up having to use his brain a lot to get out of situations. And yet he's so smart. He's literally a child genius. He's really good at manipulating situations, manipulating adults, manipulating other kids to get what he wants. And he understands how the system works, even if adults don't realize that he understands how the system works. Especially when he's in the battle school. Honestly, he is playing the system harder than anyone else, and he's playing those adults like a fiddle. If you are a fan of Ender's Game, I absolutely recommend picking this up. It complements Ender's Game so well, and you get insight into small situations that happen that you would have never known happened in Ender's Game, and some of them kind of blew my mind and made me want to reread Ender's Game to see if I could spot those differences and what the whole situation that happened. Regardless, absolutely stunning, and I am actually going to be continuing this series. And the last honorable mention is yet another Brandon Sanderson book, and this is Mistborn: A Secret History. It is a novella that follows Kelsier after the events of Mistborn. Well, it's kind of like in between the events of Mistborn. I can't really discuss this book at all because it's massive spoilers for the Mistborn trilogy, but I had so much fun reading this book, and it really gave me insight into more of how the Cosmere works because it just fascinates me, and I can't wait to fully dive in and figure out how everything will eventually click together. But it was such a delightful novella. My favorite novella I've ever read in my life, and I love the size of this. It's so quaint, and it was a delight to read as well. And thus, we have finally reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts about my top 5 reads and some honorable mentions as well. Please let me know your top 5 reads as well if you want to share, and let me know if you've read any of these. And if you disagree wholeheartedly with any of my opinions, you are also entitled to let me know because I love hearing different people's perspectives on books that I absolutely adore. And this lineup was nothing like what I expected. And although it was all over the place, I think it kind of summed up my reading year. I do hope that you enjoyed watching, and I do hope to see you in the next one. Toodles!